Sellers are desperately trying to liquidate their homes before the housing crash gets worse, particularly in certain cities where, get this folks, nearly 50% of the listings currently on the market have a price reduction. And what many of these sellers are starting to realize is that even with this initial wave of price cuts, home buyers aren't interested. Like on this listing in Phoenix, which cut the price from $800,000 to $650,000 over the last 3 weeks, well, it's still sitting here on the market on Zillow with only 37 user saves, indicating very little home buyer interest. And so what this implies, everyone, it's very important for you all to understand, is that sellers are going to have to get even more aggressive on their price cuts. They're going to need to go even lower on their prices to have any hope of attracting home buyers back into the market, which is of course going to be great news for you as a potential home buyer out there. This means that the deals are just starting to pop up. They're going to get even better over the next couple months. The parts of the country where this is going to happen first are the metros in orange, which already have a very high share of price cuts, 40 to 50% of all listings. These are the places where in the next 3 to 6 months, we're going to see an absolute crash take hold. Now, this crash might take a little longer to get to the metros in green, which still have a fairly low share of price cuts, because despite the fact that some sellers are waking up to the fact that there's a crash and aggressively cutting prices, you still have a host of other sellers who are remaining stubborn, who are willfully ignorant of the fact that the US housing market is in a crash and are saying to themselves, I'm going to come and list at a really high price and I'm not going to cut no matter what. You still have a fair amount of those sellers out there, because as the chief economist from Redfin put it, there are two kinds of sellers in today's market: those who already know the market is cooled and those who are learning about the cooling market as they go through the selling process. And so the fact that you still have this selection of sellers out there who's ignorant as to what's going on means that there's a lot more downside to go, especially when you consider how the psychology of a market crash plays out. Right now, I think a lot of sellers in the US housing market are somewhere between complacency and panic. Sellers who are panicking are the ones in markets like Phoenix and Austin and Boise and Seattle who see the writing on the wall, and they're aggressively cutting prices in those markets right now. But some sellers are still complacent. They think that this is just a minor blip in the road, that the home buyer demand is still going to be there going forward, so they're not ready to cut. But ultimately, all of these sellers are eventually going to end up at capitulation and eventually anger. They're going to have to liquidate, and they're going to be angry they waited so long to do it, because the writing is on the wall, everyone. When you zoom out and just take a more macro look at what's going on in the US housing market and economy, it's very obvious that this is just the start of the housing crash. I mean, consider first that home prices right now are at a record high, even higher than they were in 06, adjusted for inflation. On top of that, mortgage costs as a percentage of income is also now at a record high. So the US housing market has never been so expensive. That's occurring just as home builders right now are building a record number of new homes and apartments. Nearly 2 million are actively under construction. To go along with that, we have a massive foreclosure and eviction backlog from the pandemic of foreclosures and evictions that didn't occur, which are soon going to occur, which is going to flood the market with inventory. That's going to happen just as the Federal Reserve continues to tighten monetary policy, increasing interest rates and taking liquidity out of the system, which is going to lower demand for housing further. And on top of all of that, the US is now entering a recession with a big surge in layoffs. We're starting to see companies shut down. By the end of the year, don't be surprised if the unemployment rate goes from 3.6% to over 6%. All of that adds up to the fact that now is definitely not the time to buy a house. Despite the fact that we are seeing more price cuts and more homes come on the market, now is not the time, because we are only in the second or third inning of this housing crash. It's going to get much worse. And I personally feel bad for some of the people right now who are jumping back into the market. We had a slight uptick in mortgage applications over the last 2 weeks. Clearly, some people are seeing the higher inventory and they're saying to themselves, now's my time to buy. I think those people are going to be in for a desperate world of hurt, because they're buying still at a near sky-high price and a sky-high mortgage rate in a market where inventory is exploding. And boy, that inventory is surging. In a city like Austin, Texas, we've seen, get this everyone, nearly a 150% increase in the number of homes on the market in just the last 2 months. Similar situation in King County in Seattle, 140% increase. Salt Lake County, 140% increase. Collin County in Dallas, 130%. Boise, Phoenix, Boston, Las Vegas, Tampa. Inventory is exploding off the charts, showing no sign of relenting. So even if we get a couple home buyers coming back in to pick up some homes, that's not going to stop this deluge. Because here's what you all need to understand about today's housing market is that there's so many different ways for inventory to keep surging. I mentioned before the record number of homes under construction. Those are going to start to be completed over the next year, and that's just going to cause inventory to keep going up. We have that foreclosure and eviction backlog. I talked in my last video about how 13 million Americans right now are behind on either their rent or their mortgage payment. They weren't evicted or foreclosed on during the pandemic due to government regulation. Those regulations are gone. So we're going to see those evictions and foreclosures surge, which is going to aggressively and continually add inventory to the housing market. We're also seeing investors starting to buy fewer homes. They're having difficulty raising money to buy those homes, and some of them are even now selling their homes. These investors are liquidating, particularly ones who own Airbnb and short-term rental units. There was just a report released which said that Airbnb and Vrbo occupancies plummeted in May because there's simply too many new listings on the market. There was a 22% increase in Airbnb and short-term rentals year over year. Now their revenue is starting to decline. We're going to see many of those people sell their short-term rental properties. But despite my general prediction that inventory is going to keep increasing, I think a lot of you want to know, when is going to be the time to buy? I know a lot of you are still circling the housing market. You want prices to go down, and you want to know when the time to strike is going to be. And the answer to that question really depends on the city and housing market you live in. There are certain areas in America that are in massive bubbles. Austin, Texas would be one. Boise, Idaho would be another. Phoenix, Arizona would be a third. These markets are going to have massive collapses. They're going to take a long time to play out. And so if you're trying to buy in some of those markets, you better get prepared for multiple years of price declines before we reach a bottom. Because historically, housing crashes, folks, take 5 years to go from peak to trough. That's how long the last housing crash took, from 2007 to 2012. That's how long certain regional housing crashes took in the early 90s. For instance, Los Angeles had a 6-year decline in home prices from 1990 to 1996. And so I think it's important to have that perspective, right? That a housing crash is not necessarily like a stock market crash. It's not going to happen as instantaneously. It's going to take longer to occur. But with that said, I think there are certain markets in America where this could happen faster, particularly a place like California. California has a lot of headwinds going on right now in its economy. It's very tech driven. And of course, the tech industry is suffering a lot. Higher interest rates mean that the already sky high home prices in California are even more unaffordable. I wouldn't be surprised if California's crash happens fast, because there's simply not a lot of buyers out there who could support today's market. And we're seeing, for instance, home tours in California are down 47% from the start of the year. Another part of the country where I think this crash is happening even faster than I anticipated is Florida, particularly the western coast of Florida. Metros like Tampa, Cape Coral, and Naples only 4 months ago had like no inventory and no price cuts on the market. Now nearly half of the listings in these areas in western Florida have a price cut. And that's going to happen in cities that have a big exposure to investors, such as Florida, right? There's a lot of investors buying in Florida. So when those investors all of a sudden stop buying and then start selling, you could have a very quick flip of the housing market where inventory all of a sudden surges up out of control, especially from investors who are looking to liquidate at the top of the market because they don't live in the home. They just want to sell it at the highest price possible. But I need to be upfront about something, and that's that not every housing market in America right now is experiencing the housing crash. You know, if we look to the Northeast and the Midwest, we can see a fairly low share of price cuts. In previous videos, I've also talked about how home sales in the Northeast and Midwest are sustaining themselves. And so I see a lot of people in the comment section of my videos from New Hampshire and New Jersey and New York who are frustrated that the housing market's still very tight. So I want to acknowledge that, everyone. This housing crash is not happening evenly across the country, and it's not even happening evenly within certain cities. Like, you could go to a market like Phoenix, which is a top 3 crash city right now, and still find certain homes in certain neighborhoods where there's bidding wars and where there's still a lot of stubborn sellers. But the important thing to pay attention to is the broader shifts that are occurring across a county and across a metro area. So for instance, when I go on Redfin and I search in Maricopa County and Phoenix for the number of price cuts, I see that there's 4,800 in just the last 30 days. What's crazy is that that is triple the amount that it was only 45 days ago. Back on May 11th, I released a video looking at the number of price cuts in Maricopa County, and there were 1,500 at the time. So it only took 45 days for a tripling in the number of price cuts in Phoenix. What that means is if you're in Phoenix and still frustrated, or if you're in the Northeast or Midwest and frustrated that the housing crash isn't happening fast enough, just relax and look at the data, everyone. That's going to be your coach. That's going to be your North Star. Look at how much the inventory is going up. Look at how much the price cuts are surging, and think about all the macroeconomic headwinds like a recession, like the backlog, eviction, and foreclosures. And you're going to really understand how this housing crash is just getting going, and that now is definitely not the time to buy. Now, one last thing, everyone. Those of you who have been long-term viewers to my channel might remember that I did a video in early April predicting this deluge of price cuts in the US housing market. Back then in early April, there were very few on the market, but I looked at key data points which predicted that this was going to happen. A lot of people told me I was crazy back then. You could go to the comment section section of that video. I would encourage many of you to watch that video right now so you can see how I used fundamental data 2.5 months ago to predict what's happening now and how that same fundamental data can be used to predict what's going to happen in the future. Maybe you don't see a lot of price cuts out there. This data suggests it's important that you actually pay attention to how much the prices are being cut on the listings where there is a price cut, because that is a signal of seller desperation. That's the signal, the early warning sign that sellers are trying to get out of the market.